Most people still use heart rate to measure how hard or intense they're actually training. And for endurance sport, continuous sports like cycling and running, this works really well. But for functional sports, it might be a completely different story. Their heart rate zones can be completely off. And in this video, I will explain some of the physiology behind this phenomenon, why your heart rate might be reacting more to changes in posture or pressure from the muscle compared to reacting towards metabolic load or increases in intensity. And at the end of the video, I will show you some pretty interesting and quite exclusive data from CrossFit Games athletes to exactly prove that point. I will show you much smarter ways to gauge your intensity during functional workouts as often seen in high rocks and CrossFit. All right, super excited for this one. Let's go straight into it. Hi everyone, welcome back to another wod-science video. My name is Gomar, I'm a senior scientist at ETH Zurich based in Switzerland. And for the last decade or so I studied and taught different aspects of exercise physiology, and my goal now is to bring some of the science that I learned back to you guys. So you probably have seen circulating on the internet this kind of graph where the different training zones are expressed as a percentage of your maximal heart rate, which would then be your exercise intensity. And obviously zone 1 and zone 2 here in gray are rather at lower percentages of your heart rate peak, around 55 to 80 tops, I would say, for zone 2. And then you have zone 3, zone 4 and zone 5, which are very close to your maximal heart rate. And then you can also overlay this with the lactate curve. For example, if you would take lactate every minute or every 3 minutes during a maximal exercise test to exhaustion, a RAM test to exhaustion we call that, you see that lactate in the beginning at very low exercise intensities stays rather low because there's low glycolytic energy production, and then it goes up towards very high levels, 11, 12, 13, and even higher in CrossFit athletes. And also based on that, you can kind of gauge your different training zones going from aerobic mixed to also having a large anaerobic part. So that's pretty well known, and it comes basically from the fact that heart rate is linearly related to exercise intensity. For example, if you would plot watts, which is intensity, which is joule per second, over oxygen uptake or heart rate, you see almost a linear increase. It makes sense, right? The higher the intensity, the more oxygen the muscles need, so your oxygen uptake will go up, but also there needs to be more oxygen delivery from the heart, from the cardiovascular system, and therefore your heart rate basically linearly increases. And that is how many scientists, and also, for example, the Norwegian Olympic Committee, came up with this table. I think it's quite interesting for you, for your reference, where the different training zones are expressed in different ways of assessing intensity. For example, percentage of your VO2 max, lactate as well, I see, and also importantly, your percentage of your heart rate max. And that is how most of the wearables, such as Garmin, Polar, calculate your training zones. It's mostly based on heart rate, not on the other measurements, because obviously it's not feasible to do that without external measurements such as spirometry and so on. So that's pretty useful and actually really well known for endurance type sports, where you have contractions that are not very forceful, 20 to 30% of your maximal voluntary contraction, and very continuous, so you keep doing them for a long period of time. But this is obviously completely different than why you are here for in the video, for the functional sports, for more functional movements, thrusters, burpees, pull-ups, wall balls, and so on. Here, different physiological principles affect the heart rate. And I think this is highly interesting. I did quite some digging to get you this information, so bear with me. It's a little bit more physiology in nature, but I think quite interesting for you to learn. So why I would say this is not, or these training zones are not necessarily useful for functional sports when you're doing functional movements, has first of all to do with the baroreflex and the orthostatic swings. So what do I mean with that? It's actually pretty straightforward. When you do, for example, a burpee or even a burpee broad jump, even better, you go from a lower, like a laying down position, to standing straight up. And when you do that movement, there is a part of the blood that stays, let's say, in the lower body. There is a slight pooling of blood in the lower body. And what happens at that moment is that for a split second, there will be less, we call this venous return, so less blood that is redelivered to the heart. So what happens? the heart gets less blood, so there will be less preloading, and the stroke volume, the amount of volume that the heart can pump per beat, will be lowered. And obviously, the body doesn't really like that because this could lead to a drop in blood pressure. And that is certainly something that the whole system doesn't like. So what happens is something that we call the baroreflex. And baroreflex means that the body does everything in its power to keep the blood pressure stable. Otherwise, you're literally going to faint. And that's certainly not what the body wants. So what happens is, due to the baroreflex, there will be an immediate increase in heart rate. All right, less stroke volume, higher heart rate, so you have the same cardiac output during your burpee broad jumps and your different movements. A really, let's say, oiled machine, your body. But what happens, or what is a consequence, is that your heart rate spikes. That is not necessarily due to higher intensity, for example, as I just showed during cycling, or higher watts during biking. No, it is literally a reflex towards higher pressure, higher or different changes in blood volume. Pretty interesting and well documented. For example, I will link a very interesting article by Deranged Physiology exactly on this topic of postural changes and affecting heart rate and stroke volume. Well worth your time to read a little bit and to dig a little bit deeper into. So that's one, because certainly that's something that happens all the time in functional sport, where you go from a supine position towards an upright position, or where you have changes in body posture. For example, I just did the burpee broad jumps, but certainly also handstand push-ups, even pull-ups, wall balls, and so on and so forth. And then a second aspect that has something to do with the baroreflex is related to intramuscular pressure during high or forceful contractions. So think about it, you're doing front squats or heavy wall balls or sled push, you're contracting the muscle way more forcefully than when you are biking or when you are rowing, even at high wattages. That's important to know. So what happens is that there's a lot of buildup of intramuscular pressure, and this makes literally the small veins and the arterioles collapse in the muscle. So the blood is squeezed out and the oxygen is still being used at that time. So there's no oxygen delivery anymore, because you literally just squeeze out all the blood at that fraction of a second when you are contracting that forcefully. And what we can see here, for example, the oxygenation in the muscles, so the muscle oxygen, literally live muscle oxygen, is also collapsing or going quickly down. Here, for example, I measured with Train Red, a nurse device, the oxygenation during heavy load squats in a healthy young CrossFitter. These were 8 reps. And you literally see between the reps that the oxygen comes back a little bit, but then when he's forcefully contracting, it actually squeezes out all the blood, and the oxygenation drops like a stone. And then when he stops all his reps, it recovers quickly, like we usually see. So this is a good example showing that the muscle really acts like almost a tourniquet. Instead of helping like a venous pump, helping the blood or the venous blood going back to the heart from the toes, from the calf, and so on. No, it actually blocks the venous returns during heavy load contractions, and this, exactly as before, or what I said before, this will lead to a decreased venous return, a decreased stroke volume, and therefore a higher heart rate that is more related to pressure instead of related to intensity. Pretty interesting to see. Also here, there's some papers describing this. I just show you one here that you can also look at. I will add also this one to the show notes if you want to learn a little bit more about this. So you can say, okay, but what your example is really extreme. I mean, you showed very heavy load contractions. Back squats, this was at 80% of your 1 RM. This is not really what happens in a WOD, right? Well, here you see the muscle oxygenation of the first left side of the graph is 4 times 8 back squats. So you see a nice drop in muscle oxygenation, recovery, nice drop, and so on. Exactly what I just explained. And then after some rest, I let the athlete do a high or powerful workout where they did 12 cals on the air bike, then into 10 wall balls, into 10 jumping lunges. All right, so you would call this a functional circuit. Then they rested 4 minutes and they did this again for 4 times. And you see that actually the deoxygenation is even more than during the back squats. So this means that indeed also during functional movements at high intensity, this squeezing out of the blood and this high pressure environment is there, which will lead to a lower venous return. And as I said, the bioreflex and so on, related to a higher heart rate. Pretty interesting to see, in my opinion. And then the third aspect that is not really related to physiology, but just a bit of, let's say, first principle thinking, is that, for example, when you are doing AMRAPs, right? It's a good example. You do a 15-minute AMRAP of pretty heavy power snatches, wall balls, some biking, and maybe some burpees, right? If you think about it, how much you're actually moving in that AMRAP, you would be surprised how little that is. Depending a little bit on the workout, I would say that most people are resting at least 30 to even 40% of the whole workout time. So there's a lot of just time standing around. For example, here, to prove my point, we measured with wod-motions, which is a movement sensor that can detect the different movements in functional fitness. We measured my performance during 25.1, which is a workout, a continuous workout of burpees, of hang clean and jerk with a dumbbell, a light dumbbell, and lunges. So very light and pretty easy movement, performed at high intensity. And you see here the white spots or the white bars. These are the times that I was literally resting. I was not doing anything. And when you check the overall data, even in a very light, pretty easy accessible, I would say, AMRAP, I was resting 18% of the time of the whole 15 minutes. So this means that because of the intermittent nature of the sport, it's not really a good idea to just look at your heart rate, because it could be that you're doing very intense and even heavy exercises, and then you rest, whatever, 30, 20 seconds. Maybe your heart rate will give something, whatever, 160, but the actual intensity, and certainly we call this the instant power generation, is way higher than what your heart rate would show you. So the intermittent nature of the sport, certainly in CrossFit, also in Hyrox a little bit less, there has a large effect on your average heart rate and your heart rate zones, I would say. Excellent. Before I go on and explain some of the data, pretty exclusive data, I have to say, of CrossFit Games athletes who would prove this point, I want to talk about the different programs that we have related to functional sports, CrossFit and Hyrox. What we do at wod-science, we really try to be very meticulous in managing the training load, making the training fun, but also progressively overload the athlete, being it in running or functional movements related to Hyrox, but also skills, strength, and powerful workouts in CrossFit. So if you're interested in supporting the page, supporting all the information that I share here, and get fit along the way, don't hesitate to quickly scan the QR code that is popping up right now. We have 7-day free trials. More and more athletes are joining the community, and that's pretty fun because then you have big leaderboards of athletes who are doing the same workouts as you, and you can also share your experience in a Discord group that we have, where you can also ask questions about the different programs, about the different workouts to all of our coaches. So if you're interested, click the first link in the description or scan the QR code. Really appreciate it. Thank you for that. All right, let's go to the juicy part of this video. Let's look at some practical examples of CrossFit Games athletes that we tested, and showing that their heart rate related to the different training zones is not fully correct. So what did we do? We had a couple athletes, like high caliber athletes, right? And we let them do a functional ramp test to exhaustion. I put it on the screen here. It's basically burpees and thrusters to exhaustion, where you always every 5 minutes increase the amount of burpees in reps and the amount of weight that you put on the bar for the thruster. So you always make the intensity higher and higher. You don't do this on the bike. You do this actually with functional movements. If you're interested in actually doing this test yourself, I will put a link in the description, the second link in the description, to our programming software Strive, where you can sign up, and there you can see the test in great detail and also have a leaderboard of other people who have done this. But as I said, those athletes, some of the highest caliber athletes in the world, did this test, and we measured different variables. For example, here you see on the x-axis the different intervals, so always think about it as increasing intensity. Then in blue is the lactate, going from pretty low, 2.1, 2.4, 2.4, 2.7, and so on, to very high, 11.94. And then also the heart rate. You see nicely the linear increase in heart rate. But look at the percentages of maximal heart rate at the different let's say, lactate threshold, so at the different zones. And as I said, your zone 2, what we call zone 2, your aerobic zone, basically ends where the first increase or the noticeable increase in lactate happens compared to baseline. And for this athlete, it was at 90% of his maximal heart rate. Even when doing 6 burpees, right, per minute, that's very low, and 12 thrusters in the next minute. For him, this was an absolute warm-up at RPE 3. His heart rate was 170, 172. If he does 172 on the bike, he's pushing hard. So this shows that just merely changing the position during the burpees and also having the heavy load contractions during the thrusters has a massive effect, I would say, on his heart rate. Does that mean that his zone 2 is at heart rate 165, like his Garmin says? No, I would say for functional movements, his zone 2 threshold would be at heart rate, whatever, 175 to 180. Way higher probably than what is on the bike. So you can say, okay, yeah, this is just one example. This could be a pure exception to the rule. Well, this is an example of another CrossFit Games athlete who did exactly the same test. And you see beautiful, a lower lactate curve in the beginning, or at least a lower lactate value in the beginning, and then nicely rising up to very high levels at the end, exactly how we expect. And here, actually, his heart rate starts a bit lower and goes also in a beautiful linear line. Only at the end, it flattens out, as we usually see. And for him, his lactate threshold 1, so his first initial rise of lactate compared to baseline, is approximately 83% of his maximal heart rate, and his lactate threshold 2 was at 93%. So this is more close, I would say, to the training zones that I explained in the beginning of the video, but still definitely on the high side. And then a third example is showing almost exactly the same thing. He almost has no zone 2, meaning that his lactate basically goes up from the get-go, and also starts with very high heart rate. I think much of this has to do with the changing in position. And for him, his lactate threshold 2, so his most, let's say, exponential part of the curve, which is close to his what we call threshold pace, is at 95% of his maximal heart rate. This is absolutely not achievable on the bike or on the rower. For him, it's only related to functional movement and functional threshold movements. Very important to understand, and very important to also take this into account when you are watching your heart rate doing, for example, an AMRAP or a 4-time workout. What your heart rate is saying at that moment is not necessarily corresponding to the right or the actual intensity of your movements. So the question is, okay, Gomar, you can say this is very nice. You have like this very advanced techniques to actually assess this in top athletes. How can I benefit from this information? How can I use this information? Well, the first thing I would say is, don't look too much at your heart rate monitor for gauging your intensity during functional movement or functional workouts. Think more about your RPE, how hard it actually feels for you internally. One is going to be you're laying on the bed, sleeping like a baby, very easy stuff. And then the scale goes up to moderately hard, very hard, and extremely hard, which would be full exhaustion, for example, at the end of a Fran. And if you have problems with gauging your RPE, because a lot of athletes tell me this, I don't actually know exactly what my RPE is during specific workouts. What you can do is doing this functional ramp test to exhaustion and write your RPE, how hard it feels, after every interval. And it should be very low, or pretty low at least in the beginning. And then you get, or you ramp up to the maximal intensity all the way at the end. And that gives your brain, let's say, your body, a good idea, okay, how hard is each interval, and how hard is, for example, RPE 4, RPE 5, and RPE 10. Here is an example of one of the athletes that I just showed. And here, this is a scale from 6 to 20. So it's a little bit different than 1 to 10, but it's the same thing. And it almost perfectly corresponds to his actual training zones based on lactate. When he does a workout at 10 out of 20 subjective feeling, this will be close to his specific zone 2 threshold or aerobic threshold, using again functional movements. When he hits 15 to 16, right, the end of the yellow zone, then it will be closer to his second threshold or his lactate threshold too. So that's for him pretty useful, and this is also something you can use in your own training. Importantly, when you are doing maybe more Hyrox style workouts where you have a lot of ergs and a little bit of functional movement, so it's more of a continuous movement, then I think heart rate can be a very good gauge. So don't completely throw away your heart rate monitor. I'm not saying that it's not a useful tool. It just has to be pretty continuous. The movement should be very continuous, not too much moving up and down, not too much pressure in the muscle. And then for sure, heart rate is a great gauge of your actual intensity. When you want to go even more, let's say, specific and you need some tools, for example, you can use NURSE to understand your muscle oxygenation at certain intensities. You can use, hopefully in a not so distant future, WOD motions to understand your actual power, your watts that you're producing during the functional movements, because at the end of the day, if you know your watts, that is the end boss of intensity, the amount of work you're doing per second or per minute is your actual intensity. And if you can then translate that to functional movements, obviously you know perfectly where your different training zones are, just like cyclists or runners do that with speed or power. Cool, I hope this helped. I hope you now have a little bit of critical perspective to when your Garmin tells you you have been working for 40 minutes in zone 5 after a medium intensity Hyrox workout. That probably is more related to your position and the intramuscular pressure than the actual intensity of the workout. If you get some value out of this video, please don't hesitate to share with like-minded friends and like the video and subscribe to the channel. Really much appreciated. If you want to dig a little bit deeper into the science of functional sports, Hyrox, CrossFit and all that cool stuff, have a look at the videos that YouTube is recommending right now. Thank you for watching and see you in the next one. Ciao.